And I would like to start by welcoming everyone to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. And I would also really like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we're meeting. So for me personally, I'm on Jagera and Turrbal country here in Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. My name is Olivia, and I'll be chairing the session today. And our first presenter is Weifeng. And yeah, you're welcome to start whenever you're ready. If you can share your slides, please.
Okay, thank you. So hello guys, this is Weifeng. I'm from Australian National University. I'm doing a Bachelor of Arts. I'm in my third year. My major is Gender, Sex, and Cultural Studies. My minor is Sociology. So basically, my classes and research interests are focused on like sex communication, sex contact, people's intimate relationships, and some gender issues. I'm also interested in feminism series as well as queer series. So, well, this presentation about my essay is called Sex Consent, Not Merely in Love to Regulate Respectful Relationships. This is part of my course of philosophy 3075 as my final paper. It's a literature-based research, and my methodology is basically rely on I search a lot of literature papers over 30, and I examine them doing some qualitative analysis, and then write my own paper. So I'm very proud to have the chance to present here to share my ideas and papers. Yeah, so this paper is mainly focused on discussing the effectiveness and the role of sex consent in constructing respectful and healthy sexual relationships in our everyday life. So to note that here I only discuss a target group as people who are adults, they are able and without any influence of drugs or alcohol, other stuff. So just simply discuss this target group. And my keywords would be focused on feminism and queer theory, some gender issues debates, gender inequality issues, and other important issues in sex communication. So the background is here. So of course, sex concept is not using in law, sociology, or philosophy. We can basically do that in our everyday life, and we can sometimes know it in our education. And even from this century, discussions around such concept, power, and healthy or respectful sexual relationships have long been examined by feminist theories. Also, there is a heated debates around the public and also academic scholars. So of course, it is a very important issue and the criterion in the discussion of sex education. And also the recent Time Up and Me Too movements also have attracted public attention to some victims as non-homosexual individuals, such as some gay men who are being victims of some Hollywood, issues or something. So this is a general background. And for this essay, the aim of writing this essay is to respond to the debates around the usefulness of sex consent. And I actually examine and criticize the role of sex consent in both heterosexual, male and female relationships, and also some gay men's male relationships. And my argument is that sexual consent is a cruel optimism in both heterosexual and homosexual male relationships. This concept actually, tends to reflect gender inequality and facilitated sexual violence rather than alleviating them. So first, I examine the limited functions of sex consent. Of course, it's useful. I can't say there's no meaning of it at all. So sex consent often serves as the formal minimum standard for unproblematic sex. Yeah. So examining some feminism or sociology literature, the term sex consent is often used to imply a boundary, defining some sex with problems or without problems, distinguishing good sex or bad sex, or just people making love or some criminal acts. And from the legal perspective, consent is central to the issue of defining sex behavior, distinguish sex and rape. And the lack of sex consent in sex encounters is often defined as a characteristic of sexual violence. So getting consent in recent years has become a very central to sex violence prevention activism and also some educational programs. So which we should acknowledge its meaningful functions. So like this picture says, sex without consent means to rape to a large base. But the effectiveness of sex consent tend to be limited. We can find that some scholars argue that it is only viewed as a formal minimum requirement for okay sex. Sex with consent may only represent valid sex, but not wanted sex or desired sex. Like people agree with that to do sex. It's just like acceptable, but that means both of the person really love it or desire to have it. So it's just a very basic acceptance within people's acceptability, but not reflect the true willingness or desire or moral permission. And also, yeah, it overlooks many other important aspects, including the reality of sexual encounters as experience beyond the law. So then I focused on some analysis through the gender perspective to show what are limitations of the sex consent in the reality and practice. So the first limitation is around its own concept and definition. So it's very hard to people to make agreement to decide what is really consent, what it should be defined or reached, and how it is communicated. So, for example, for some homosexual date, so maybe girls will agree to hang out or just a night out, maybe just consent to something like kiss or hug, but it doesn't mean they really consent to sex. So some men may misunderstand some signals, and in some cultures actually men usually assume consent in some public settings, like for example in Chinese culture. So for some women who went to the nightclubs or some dancing clubs, some men may assume they give consent already, or just misunderstood they are flirting equals to a real sex consent. So that's a way different people view consent. And also people's gender roles, their different sexual psychology makes a difference in making them understanding what the consent is, and making more barriers in between the sex communication. And also the mode of sex consent itself have some problems. Like the model, one requests consent and one gives permission or reject. This model is not that equal. The request and consent or refuse model shows one is active, one is passive, and for some people, usually could be women, the pressure to give consent because of the relationships or because of the environment, atmosphere, or just some gender sexual norms, so which tend to be problematic. And my essay focus on some discussions around women's sex communication. So in some cultures and in some cases, women's actual communication ability is often restricted by the local social and gender norms. Like in some cultures, women are expected to be more submissive, or just more to follow men's advice or their willingness. So sometimes they tend to give consent not out of their willingness. And it is more a serious problem in some women in relationships, like they're in dating or they're in marriage. Like men are easily to assume women are always willing to give them consent since they are in relationship. And some women, they are frightened of they lose a relationship, or their relationship could be short-lived if they can't provide some sex life to men. That makes some sex communication lose its meaning, it become pointless, because there are some pressure out of the society to the woman. And also for some people who do the hookup, they also feel pressure if they do some flirting, or even they are approved to meet in person. They would feel very they would feel very pressured to reject at the last moment. And then my paper focused on gay men's sex communication as a case study of a queer community. So actually they have more risks and challenges when they are doing some sex communication. Like gay men are often assumed with hypermasculinity and hypersexuality. Like generally people or their own peers assume they always want to have sex or they're ready to have sex. So when they got some invitation, sometimes people feel hardly to reject because of their own identity, and which is also could be linked with sociology's theory of the working class self.
Hi, Weifeng. Sorry, we've just reached the 10 minutes. Do you have a summary statement of the talk, please?
Yeah, I almost done. Just like giving face some challenges of their own identity. Even more than homosexual women they face to, and also their sexual activities are diverse. Some gay men may just prove to have some oral sex or just a hand job, but not the whole sex. Usually they have the weaker verbal sex communication, and which leads to some risks. So it's the problem they face. So I know it's a very broad topic, and we should have more focus on the debates around it. And I hope more and more people would focus on this and work on reducing some social norms, inequalities rooted in social norms, and could make more progress in the future. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I'll now leave a few minutes for Anya. Thanks, Rebecca. Exactly. We can't do all
Sorry, I don't notice the time. So yeah, sorry for my speed.
That's okay. So I'll leave, normally we ask questions from both judges, but I will ask Gatra and also the audience. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A.
Sure, can I ask my question? Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Weifeng. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate you on a job well done in covering a very broad literature in a short presentation. I think your points are quite clear, and especially considering the broadness of your topic, and you offered a very good critique of the literature on consent. My question surrounds how you think your findings builds on this existing literature on consent. So can you clarify what the research puzzle is, and how you believe your analysis addresses this puzzle and adds to the existing literature?
Yeah, so my proposal is to criticize the role of sex consent in building respect for sexualities, because I noticed that in some mainstream voice, they believe sex consent is important in the sex education and some social movements, and believe it's a way to reduce the sex violence and rape. But I think some people overlooks some other many more aspects, like even if some people give consent, is that really consent? And that really represent, for example, I want to have sex with someone, it's really out of my trueness, and I'm really from my own, follow my own heart, not other social and gender norms. Because I think sometimes problems are not resulting from two people's communication. It's from the larger society, how the social, gender, sexual norms expect people to do, and how they are affected by the the existing gender norms. Do they really explore their true self and express their true willingness, rather than just to perform their good citizen, or just they perform their gender roles? So it's some debates around people's or gender roles, some performativity, and their true self. And I searched for some literature more about some post-feminism theories, and use some feminist perspective to examine this problem. So I know for some philosophy, they discuss just some gender and body. People give consent because they have a free agency of their body, or from law they think, okay, the consent is clear, it's not break the laws. I want to focus on more about women's or just some gender queers, their own gender roles, their gender and sexual psychology, and associated with the whole society, and what drives them to make consent, that what does their consent represent. And I hope people could pay more attention and give more focus on this concept and the practice. And I hope, something could be changed. Like I say, it's a cruel opposition. So yeah, we can have some positive expectations of this problem, but it's very cruel because, like I said, still people are affected by the society too much, and society is not that equal in many gender issues and just people citizenship. Yeah, so it's very cruel, but hopefully it would change in the future.
Thank you. Did that answer your question, Gertrude? Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that comprehensive answer. And I also just want to mention that our second judge is unavailable to make it due to technical difficulties, but they'll review it upon recording. So while you won't be able to see them, they definitely will be seeing this and reviewing this.
Thank you all.
And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A forum. So I think that will lead me to thank you again, Weifeng, and now invite speaker 2, Brooke, to speak and share your slides, please.
Kia ora. My name is Brooke Petre. Thank you for joining me. I am incredibly fortunate that my academic pursuits can be applied directly across my career. Within my role, I oversee the behaviour and welfare of residents that live in our halls. There isn't a lot of research focused on residential experiences within New Zealand, but typically such research stems from a place of negativity and it's deficit focused. I have worked within halls of residence for almost 10 years, and as a frontline worker, I'm uniquely positioned to understand the issues that our residents face. With this project, I wanted to explore a new halls initiative where we provided a hall for LGBTIQA+ exclusively, and specifically, I wanted to understand their feelings of inclusion and support in this space. Within international literature, various studies have highlighted that LGBTIQA+ students face discrimination, harassment, or violence on campuses, and they also feel isolated and disconnected from their community. To counteract this, the concept of safe spaces across university campuses have increased in popularity, yet the role of a residential hall as a safe space is highly contested. I've used the term rainbow hall to maintain our residents' privacy and also to identify the LGBTIQA+ inclusive hall. This exploratory research was born from an undergraduate paper designed to introduce postgraduate research to students. For my research, I used an anonymous online survey to capture LGBTIQA+ resident responses on a range of questions relating to how supported they felt and if they felt that their hall was an inclusive space. Volunteers spanned across 3 different halls, with one being the Rainbow Hall. To analyse the data, I used a combination of statistical analysis for the closed response questions and applied a thematic analysis over the open-ended responses. As this project was for an undergraduate course, full ethics approval was not required, and I had a limited time frame in which to complete the research. Further, some residents chose not to answer the open-ended questions, which limited the data overall. There was a total of 11 responses to my survey. 4 were from the Rainbow Hall and 7 from the other halls. For 2 participants, their gender identity differed to their assigned sex at birth, and all but 1 respondent had disclosed their gender or sexual identity to others in their hall. This small snapshot shows the results across all resident perceptions of support and inclusion. For many residents, a strong indicator of feeling supported came from the friendships they had with other LGBTIQA+ residents. However, when we look at the comparisons of feelings of support and inclusion, we find some rather striking results. The survey found that the Rainbow Hall was an affirming space for our residents. 100% of respondents from the Rainbow Hall strongly agreed that their hall peers were accepting of their identity, compared to the 57% of LGBTIQA+ in other halls. Rainbow Hall respondents also scored positively across the acceptance questions, had disclosed their gender or sexual identity to others, and they felt supported and included within their hall. Overall, these results suggest that the Rainbow Hall provided a more supportive and inclusive environment. The findings of this study highlighted 5 key themes: connectedness, privacy, education, relevance, and safety. The strongest indicator of connectedness was identified through codes of friendship. 91% of respondents indicated that other LGBTIQA+ residents acted as supports, and when specifically asked to comment on their rating of feeling supported, 57% acknowledged friendships to some degree. Participant responses alluding to privacy allude to the perceptions of others. One resident had not disclosed their sexuality to others in their hall, and another didn't choose the Rainbow Hall because they had not come out to family. The theme of education was evident through respondents' comments relating to opinions on how to train student staff and how to make the hall environment feel more inclusive. Diversity training, safe spaces, and zero tolerance policies were both desired by the community studied and are suggested solutions in addressing homophobia on university campus within international literature. The theme of relevance potentially speaks to the increase of acceptance of LGBTIQA+ members across society. This is suggested in the study by the 80% of other hall respondents indicating that they had no preference or felt it was unnecessary to be allocated to the Rainbow Hall. Safety is deemed a significant theme within this study. Ethical limitations of the methodology restricted specific questions relating to safety. However, the quote you see is important to consider when exploring the role of residential spaces for LGBTIQA+. It is likely that residents who feel safe within their environment will also feel a sense of connection, inclusion, and feel supported. The suggestions for further research that this study highlights are significant. I found that my study, however, illuminated more questions than answers, particularly as a frontline worker. Firstly, two themes in this study are contradictory. This is seen through the division of opinions between the two groups of residents. Those residing outside of the Rainbow Hall acknowledged they didn't believe the hall was relevant for them or it was necessary. However, 4 residents chose the Rainbow Hall specifically. For one transgender student, the safety they perceived to be provided by this hall was a distinct factor in their choice of accommodation. One concern this study highlighted acknowledges the concept of performative progressiveness. This denotes the social phenomenon of publicly conforming to socially progressive attitudes toward LGBTIQA+, while still enacting in homophobic microaggressions or prejudice. We need to ask ourselves the question, is providing a Rainbow Hall an act of performative progressiveness? It could be argued that providing a separate space for LGBTIQA+ residents is merely ignoring and therefore perpetuating any heteronormative privilege that may already inhibit halls of residence spaces. We see elements of this through the theme of privacy. For one student, the fact that they had not disclosed their sexual identity to their family impacted choice of accommodation. So I question, for whom does a Rainbow Hall serve and who is excluded? It could be argued that those who are excluded might need more support from universities if they lack support in other areas of their life. Furthermore, a Rainbow Hall might heighten the visibility of residents' gender or sexuality and therefore heighten their risk as targets for disgruntled or homophobic peers. And this would absolutely compromise the stability of the safe space. A range of opinions believe that LGBTIQA+ residential spaces are immoral and an act of resegregation. However, in this study, one resident desired a safe haven amongst their community. For this person, the intentions behind providing a safe living environment for them acknowledged and accepted their identity. It enhanced their mana or their identity or their pride by offering the choice. Providing the opportunity for residents to choose such a community brings them into partnership with us. It means they are empowered by options. The survey highlights that building such a community made connections between LGBTIQA+ students within our community. It cultivated a supportive, inclusive environment, and I hope that this means our residents feel at home with us. Even with limitations to research and differing perspectives, focus should always be placed on the voices within our studies. The voices who chose to live in our Rainbow Hall wanted to live there, but the voice who wanted to feel safe, they needed to live there. Thank you so much again for your time. Are there any questions?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll open the floor to our judge, Gotcha, if you have any questions for our speaker.
Sure. Hi, Brooke. Thanks so much for that. That was also a job well done, and your findings of your research has offered much needed insight into the state of LGBTQ plus residential halls, especially in this side of the world. No doubt your research would have the potential academic and practical contributions, especially for university administrators who may be interested in the idea. And this would definitely be a good starting research to what I think could be a very impactful research project. I think my question really concerns where you want to take up the research next, and specifically if you intend to take your research to make and see how it can make the university campus a more LGBTQ plus inclusive place. And I was interested in your statistic that up to 43% of people belonging to residential halls that are not LGBTQ plus inclusive necessarily do not feel accepted in their environment. And you sort of brought up this idea that it could have the adverse implications, right? And this is definitely the case in the US, where a lot of halls that are deemed to be segregationist become targets of attacks. So yeah, where do you intend to take the research next?
I am really excited by this project because it does have, I believe, massive potential. I come from I'm at Massey University. Our university is very conservative, typically vet students, very agricultural, very conservative perspectives. So the idea of this, particularly when you start to read the literature, can be quite daunting. We chose to go ahead and do it, and then I did this study. And so I got quite a shock, wondering whether or not we'd done the right thing. I think it's really, really important to also acknowledge my identity. I am a cis female, so have no authority, I guess, in actually speaking on behalf of these residents. But the way I see it, someone needs to search more, and these studies are important. And I think any contributions to discourse is really, really important. And I am planning on doing my master's, enrolling in my master's next year. And this is absolutely one of the options that I'm looking at. And I'm just, again, juggling with the identity stuff and whether or not I should be contributing to such a story. But because of, like I said, that duality being one of the managers that manages halls, I think it's my duty, if I have any form of talent, I think that I should use that to benefit all of our people, because at the end of the day, those are the ones that, that the reason I'm here, effectively.
Yeah, thank you. Any further questions from a singular judge? Or yeah, I think Kip had a question.
Yeah, sorry. Have you considered in the future, if you do follow through with this, doing a more collaborative approach and bringing on either students or staff members who are a part of the LGBTQIA plus community where you work or where you're doing your research?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kip. Absolutely. And like I identified, because I was really quite restricted in terms of ethics, I couldn't do things like interviews, and I couldn't bring anyone else in to what I was doing. So I was incredibly limited, but absolutely. I am someone who has been trained under youth development procedures and lifting voices, and like I said, enhancing mana is absolutely something that I believe in. And the only way you can do that is by collaboration. And uplifting the voices that should be heard over my own.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like really important work, and it's a great presentation and summary of the work that you've done. So it'd be good to see where it goes in the future, and best of luck with that.
Thank you so much.
I'll now invite Kip actually to start our next presentation.
Okay, so I'm Kip and I use they, them pronouns. And this presentation is based off my 2020 honours research titled Transgender and Gender Diverse People's Experiences in Feminist Spaces in Australia. And so this research really aimed to look at the experiences of trans and gender diverse people who are choosing to engage in feminist spaces and to look at the ways that they're navigating these spaces, while also highlighting these experiences and seeing how those experiences can inform ongoing feminist debate about gender and gendered experiences. So a little bit of the background and context for this research. So feminism has a long history of excluding Black women, women of colour, disabled women, working class women and trans women, just to name a few. And so because of this exclusion, there have been calls from feminist thinkers, primarily women of colour, to expand on the idea of what it means to be a woman and to open this up. There has, however, been pushback against this, particularly from a group of feminists referred to as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. And the main argument that they have is that gender is biologically determined and that it is therefore impossible to change that. And so they particularly target trans women and they frame them as being deluded, dangerous men who are actually appropriating womanhood, while also framing trans men as being traitors to womanhood who are only looking to seek male privilege. So feminist spaces have a really long history, and while they have traditionally been spaces for women to come together and experience psychological and physical safety, that's not the only form that they take. Feminist spaces have and do try to include people of multiple genders and experiences. So the methodology for this was qualitative insider research. As I said, I'm a trans and gender diverse researcher, and I was researching other members of my community. So the data for this research came from semi-structured interviews with 6 trans and gender diverse people, primarily from New South Wales and the ACT, and they ranged in age from 25 to 60 with fairly varied genders. So one of my participants is a trans man, another participant is a woman in a transgender body, and that's a specific language she uses for herself, and the other 4 fall outside of the category of man or woman with their gender. So this research utilized gender as a social construct in order to frame my understanding of gender while using Bourdieu's theory of practice, which brings together the concepts of field, habitus, and capital to discuss how people's unique backgrounds and identities, as well as things such as their social and cultural capital, can impact the ways that they navigate spaces. So the first really big theme that came out of this research was the actual ways that participants conceptualize the idea of a feminist space. So Withers defines a feminist space as physical and online spaces where feminists come together in order to plan or undertake actions that work towards a shared goal. And while participants had similar understandings, they really placed emphasis on a feminist space being defined and characterized by feminist principles, primarily of inclusion and intersectionality, and of having shared progressive values. And this quote from Christopher really highlights that. So, he says that a space that he engages with is a feminist one by virtue of the shared values. One of the key areas of investigation for this research was the ways in which people navigated spaces. And so this navigation of spaces actually took place throughout the process of identifying spaces and actually participating in those spaces. So this quote from Charlie shows that when they found spaces, they were communicating with group organizers to try and vet how inclusive spaces were before actually choosing to participate with them. And this is something that almost all of the participants specifically discussed doing. And other strategies that we used were observing group dynamics, again, before actually choosing to participate in them, as well as choosing to remove themselves if spaces became toxic or negative, or on the other hand, choosing to actually confront people in those spaces and continue to engage in those spaces. And again, some of the core parts of this research was the idea of what are these experiences for people? And this was in both the physical and online spaces, and these were fairly varied. Overall, people discussed having more positive experiences. However, this quote from Charlie does acknowledge that they did have transphobic experiences, particularly when they were dealing with spaces that were targeting women and non-binary people. But since moving into more inclusive and diverse spaces, they've been able to have more positive experiences and actually learn from those spaces. So again, physical spaces were another avenue of investigation. So Quinn here says again that they had fairly varied experiences in physical spaces. So while they had mostly positive experiences in physical spaces, they did point out that there was actually bullying directed at trans people, non-binary people, and women. And in some cases, they were having to interact with TERFs, particularly in more open activist spaces. But this is not necessarily the case for everyone. So Susan is another participant who engaged with physical spaces. And she was actually chosen to be a member of an executive team for a women's space that she was engaging with. And when that got out to other branches, they were unhappy that Susan, a trans person, was in this space and in that position. And the members of her branch actually took time to defend her and really accept her and talk about her and recognize her gender in the process of that. And another area of research was the idea of future hopes for feminist spaces. So what participants wanted to see or not see in feminist spaces in the future. And the really overarching thing that came out in this section was the idea of the need for intersectionality and inclusion. So Alex discusses the fact that they would really like to see people of various backgrounds and disabled people being able to be more included in feminist spaces. But in order to do that, feminist spaces need to actually come to terms with the privileges that can exist in those spaces and actually work towards making them safe for people with diverse backgrounds. And a particular topic of interest that came up under the umbrella of intersectionality and inclusion is this idea of inclusion and recognition of trans and gender diverse people in these spaces. So Quinn points out that they would like to see more explicit inclusion of trans and gender diverse people in these spaces, but also as contributors and organizers, and being able to listen to trans experiences in these spaces, because trans people are uniquely positioned and have unique cultural capital around what it means to be gendered and how to experience gender. But this cultural capital is not as highly valued in feminist spaces, and therefore this is something that often goes unlistened to in favor of the cultural capital that is actually experienced by cis women. So some of the key conclusions and reflections of this research is the fact that trans and gender diverse people in this research were actually curating the spaces that they were engaging with. So they were looking for spaces that were inclusive of their identities, but also of other marginalized identities. And, you know, therefore they were having more positive experiences in these spaces. But this curation of space is also something that directly fights back and challenges arguments that have been put forward by trans exclusionary radical feminists, that trans women and other trans people are looking to invade feminist spaces and take them over, which is simply not the case. Those are just my references. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you.
No
So we now have another few 5 minutes for questions.
Can I just ask my question?
Yep. Oh, sorry. Yes. Feel free.
Awesome. Hi, Kip. That was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Told us some very interesting stories. and you've covered quite a broad topic relatively well, especially given the time constraints. And I was wondering if you can tell us what it is that perhaps surprised you most about your findings. In particular, I'm curious how your finding has added to the existing knowledge on relationship between the transgender community and TERFs, right? Has it just merely reaffirmed the notion that TERF ideology is somewhat hostile towards members of the trans community, or is it something more than that?
I think the thing that I was personally most interested in seeing was particularly how trans people were conceptualizing this idea of feminist spaces and what it meant for a space to be feminist. So like I said, my research found that rather than simply thinking of a space as feminist because it claims to be, these participants were considering spaces feminist because of the fact that people had shared progressive values and feminist principles, particularly of inclusion, which is not something that came up in the literature. And I think that this research does reaffirm that TERF ideology is incredibly harmful to trans people, and it has been incredibly hard to actually remove from feminist rhetoric, and it's something that is still ongoing. And I think it just reaffirms that trans people who are engaging with spaces are finding spaces that are safe for them, finding spaces away from people who are directly challenging their gender and their existence. And yeah, just trying to find spaces that are safe and inclusive of them, rather than trying to fight back in spaces where they're not going to be accepted.
Some very difficult themes that I think you've covered quite well, and it's really, yeah, that research is very important to do. It is. And do we have any questions from anyone else? I don't see any in the Q&A forum, but I think, yeah, perfect.
Sorry, I don't have a question, Kip. I would be super interested in reading your paper if you were able to, or be interested in sharing it.
Yeah, if you put your email in the chat or something, I'm happy to send you either the whole thing or the plain word summary of it as well.
I'm a reader, so yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Excellent. Yeah, we've got our private chat where that can facilitate that. And then I think we'll move on to our last talk from Rebecca. So feel free to start sharing your slides when you're ready. And yeah.
Everyone can see and hear me? Awesome. And you can see my slideshow?
Yes, I can.
That's great. I'll just set up my screen properly. Alrighty, good afternoon everyone. Today I'm presenting my honours research completed last year titled Governing Through Self-Care, Neoliberalism and Gendered Labour in the Lorna Jane Brand. In a variety of ways, we are invited to introspect, improve, regulate and transform ourselves. This perpetual call to transformation is often presented as self-care. We see this in products such as mindfulness journals, health tracking technologies, and various other media that invite us to constantly work on ourselves. Increasingly, with the goal to achieve not only the ideal form in body, but also in mind, to achieve happiness. Many of these industries uniquely target women. Feminist analysis is turning to these practices and how they function as a form of self-regulation. I'm interested in fitness cultures, where the body and the mind are now associated in the pursuit of holistic health. This is evident in discourses about cultivating confidence and inner peace as the key to well-being. The impact of these cultures has been examined at great length in the context of beauty and body politics, and there is a development in the field that extends this analysis to include psychic or emotional labour. However, the latter remains a comparatively underdeveloped field of research. The ways that gendered bodywork and psychic labour are connected and reliant upon each other, and the ways in which they work within oppressive power relations remains under-examined. Therefore, my research sought to interrogate the ways in which athleisure brand Lorna Jane encourages its consumers, women, to take up the bodily and psychic labour of self-care, and how this reflects neoliberal forms of self-regulation. I divided my research into the themes of self-regulation and gendered labour. I'll first define two key terms, beginning with neoliberalism. For sociologists, neoliberalism refers broadly to an ideological system that is characterized by an extension of market rationality to every sphere of political and social life. Neoliberal discourses redefine citizenship as market participation and self-improvement, requiring us to be entrepreneurial and self-sufficient. These discourses have also begun to influence feminist ideas. Some scholars refer to this as neoliberal feminism, whereby feminism is reshaped into a matter of individual empowerment achieved through consumption. Another term used by feminist scholars is post-feminism. It has been applied in various ways, and I take Gill's theorization as the most nuanced and influential. For Gill, the post-feminist media culture refers to the paradoxical set of discourses about gender and femininity that have come to define feminism's presentation in popular culture. These paradoxes arise in part through the convergence of neoliberal individualism with feminist notions of collective empowerment. The body, in particular, becomes a site through which women's empowerment is expressed within popular culture. It is the key site of women's value and social capital, something much critiqued within the feminist movement, and where self-transformation is made visible. Post-feminist media culture is progressively geared towards bodily regulation and transformation as a form of self-care. My research found that the Lorna Jane brand, while premised on health and well-being and presenting an image of feminine empowerment, nonetheless contributes to the enduring regulation of female bodies and increasingly minds through the promotion of an array of self-care practices. In particular, the brand encourages a range of psychic self-care practices that constitute new forms of gendered labor. As my research was focused on self-care being the care of one's own body and mind, a theoretical framework that identifies the connection between regulation and care of the self and broader power structures was necessary. Foucault's theory of governmentality offers such a nuanced understanding of power in modern society. It has a unique sensitivity to the dispersed nature of power and how regulation can occur at multiple sites, including the governance of oneself. An important feature of this theory is technologies of the self. These are practices that we undertake to improve or modify ourselves to conform to culturally prescribed ideals. This involves the alteration of our bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and ways of being. People are freely acting subjects who regulate themselves, and their choices are informed by discourse. As my research is focused on gender, I employed a specifically feminist critical discourse analysis incorporating Lazar's framework. This is a method that shares with Foucault's theory a core set of assumptions about the nature of discourse, ideology, and power, with the additional insight that gender is ubiquitous and deeply embedded in discourse and power relations. I chose an intratextual approach, analysing 3 points of contact within the Lorna Jane brand: the retail website, the Move, Nourish, Believe blog, and the Active Living app. Data collection was confined to 3 weeks in June and July of 2020. I didn't want to be cynical when I started my data analysis and interpretation, but everywhere I looked confirmed my hypothesis. The Lorna Jane brand contributes powerfully to the maintenance of the gender order through encouragement of aggressive self-regulation and surveillance, and the undertaking of bodily and psychic labor in the name of health. Increasingly, the uptake of health and fitness includes practices of tracking and evaluation, aided by technological developments such as apps and smartwatches. I found that the brand encourages and facilitates regulatory technologies of the self. While such practices aren't inherently disempowering and can truly be beneficial for one's self-care, the brand promotes these practices in the context of restriction and discipline in order to achieve a slim, muscular, and confident ideal. Anything less is not good enough. Importantly, the brand positions itself as promoting health rather than beauty, which reflects a shift in popular culture away from the much critiqued preoccupation with beauty and slenderness. However, the brand covertly promotes the new ideal, what Horton and her co-authors refer to as the fashionably slim and muscular body, while offering the consumer a range of tools and instructions to service this ideal. The Active Living app in particular is a shining example of new technologies of self-governance and regulation, and reflects the prevalence of surveillance into the most intimate parts of our lives. The app requires the input of weight and height measurements and encourages users to track their exercise, meals, snacks, and meditation habits. Meanwhile, the Active Living Planner provides for the tracking of food intake and exercise to review progress and plan for the future in all these areas. This, along with the brand's broader focus on goal setting and motivation, facilitates a hyper self-awareness in the subject, encouraging self-surveillance and the tracking of her health, with a view to achieving the healthy ideal, which is represented by one body type. These regulatory practices of self-care require significant effort. The concept of labor has been a major concern within feminist studies. Along with the undervaluing of domestic and care work primarily undertaken by women, scholars have identified the exhaustive nature of beauty and body work, which now incorporate fitness and health practices. Feminist analysis has also begun to turn to psychic dimensions of neoliberal self-care and post-feminist media culture. These beauty and fitness practices constitute labor that is culturally required of all women. The Lorna Jane brand expects consumers to transform themselves, including the development of not only fit and healthy bodies, but a confident, calm, and organized mindset. I identified 5 forms of psychic labor in the brand. In the next slides, I show examples from the data for each. These are, firstly, reflection and evaluation of oneself and one's goals. For the Lorna Jane woman, life is a constant self-improvement workshop. Secondly, time management and organization. This is exemplified in the active living planners and meal planning tables in the brand's cookbooks. Thirdly, mindfulness and inner peace. Meditation is a practice that takes time and commitment, such as through the daily prescription of meditation in the Active Living app. Fourthly, the cultivation of self-confidence and a positive state of mind. The brand touts the power of positivity and believing before doubting. And finally, restraint for health purposes. In addition to regulatory techniques already discussed, the brand implores us to consider smaller portions before overindulging and lightening up our festive spreads. While mindfulness and meal prepping can have great benefits for health and well-being, in the broader context of the brand, these practices not only constitute labor, but also disguise the extent and role of bodily labor encouraged through self-care discourses. More still, their presentation as self-care rather than labor further entrenches the chronic undervaluing of gendered labor. The presentation of these regulatory practices as a freely made choice, indeed as self-care, is governance in action. This has the ultimate effect of maintaining beauty ideals and gender norms. This is lived out in the brand through the imagery it presents and the discourses it supports and the social practices that it encourages and praises, a push from within to work out, eat clean and believe in yourself as if it were actually that simple. Post-feminist media culture evolves and brands along with it. On this slide are some images pulled from Lorna Jane's website and social media from late 2020. We can see they feature a diversity of women that was not previously present, a lack of which had been heavily criticized. This represents a dialogue between popular discourse, brands, and cultural critique, in much the same way that these brands have adopted the language of health, strength, well-being, and indeed empowerment in response to critique of traditional feminine beauty norms. The Lorna Jane brand seems to have taken on wider criticisms of its exclusionary sizing and imagery. The main intention of my research is to contribute to the ever-growing body of feminist scholarship. Building on the work of Foucault and Lazare, it is my hope that my analysis of a highly visible Australian brand, in a cultural moment characterized by more accessible feminism and a shift towards health and well-being, can act as one more stepping stone in the revelation of the impact that discourse and gender have upon our everyday lives, and how, in turn, our everyday lives can make or break cycles of power. And here on this slide, I've got a nice photo of me crossing a creek on some stepping stones to assist with the visual. And these are my references. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Really, again, another insightful topic and very, very relevant. Gertrude, do you have any questions for Rebecca the presentation?
Yep, I do. Thanks very much for that, Rebecca. That was also a job very well done, highlighting sadly another story about how neoliberalism has co-opted, the women empowerment agenda. But my question concerns the lessons that you have gained from this Lorna Jane case study, and how you think this adds to the broader literature on fitness culture as an arena of intersection between neoliberalism and feminism. So in other words, how can other feminist scholars benefit from your study?
Yeah, so I took it as a case study, as you said, of this kind of new emerging field of research in feminist scholarship that's looking at the psychic dimensions of neoliberalism, neoliberal feminism, and how that also intersects with the concept of labor. So in the 90s, we have Naomi Wolf talking about body and beauty labor, the very well established concepts. And then in the past 5 or so years, the scholarship has been looking at that psychic dimension and this kind of entrepreneurial transformative subjectivity that is expected of all of us. And so my research was sort of site of a cultural artifact, I guess, a cultural artifact where we can kind of see that in really sharp focus. I think the Active Living app is a horrifying and amazing example, I think, of this kind of like self-governance, self-regulatory, entrepreneurial, trying to be perfect ideal that is really pushed onto us very, very much so in popular culture. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that is a very pertinent topic and very interesting. I don't think I definitely would never have considered that before. Especially when it's all done as a name of good faith. Would any participants like to put a question in the Q&A chat? We've still got a couple of minutes available for questions. And while, we have a question from Mimi. So for Rebecca, how could brands do better in not giving into harmful beauty ideas?
It's kind of tricky because in a lot of ways, as I said, and I demonstrated in one of my latest slides, Lorna Jane has listened to the very extensive critique of them and included more diverse imagery and sizing in their brand as of late. And to me as a researcher, I'm like, they just did that because they kind of had to, or they weren't going to make as many sales. So I don't really know how to answer that question or how to reconcile it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. It's definitely not on you to have all the answers.
It's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah, it's definitely something good for us to consider. Complex issue. I'll wait just to see if there's any other questions, and if anyone else would like to comment on that from the presenters. Otherwise, I think 10 minutes over time will probably bring us to the end of today's session. So I just want to thank Petre, our judge, and congratulations to all our student presenters. So this recording will be made available online. Yes, you're right. I can't clap, but.
One thing I miss most about, in-person conferences, you can't clap for each other.
Yeah, I'm sorry you're missing out on the audio sensation of an applause, but I think I like this alternative better than nothing. Yeah, this recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. And I think I have another message. No, just thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as there are no more questions, I think we'll end it there. But I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thank you for joining.
Great job, everybody.